And let me just remind you where we are in the scheme of things. I'll just show the timetable again. So we're on day 3, and next week we'll be looking at chapter 6. So we're forced to jump a number of chapters simply because there are more chapters than sessions. So just to remind you that towards the end, I'll put up a poll to find out what your preferences are in terms of the final session. We'll kind of take a vote on that. So, you know, if you can take a look at some point through the chapters that we're not dealing with, just the summaries of them, then we'll, you know, decide what to look at. And also next week, Sinem and Margaret are taking a slot in for short presentation during the session on narratives. So again, if anybody, and we had Girish last session talking about motivation. So if anybody would like to take a slot in any of the remaining sessions, then please let me know. You're very welcome. And the plan today is that, as usual, I'll put you into breakout rooms to talk for about 10, 15 minutes, share notes on my chapter. And since it is my chapter, I thought you might, while you're talking about the takeaways or resolving any problems, also think of any specific questions you'd like to ask me about it or about the topic, and I will deal with it as a kind of question and answer session. And I do have a few more slides to show, but again, if we don't get to those, I'll make a short presentation and upload it. So that is the agenda. So I'll just stop that. Who's just joined us? Cecilia. Good morning.
Me. Hello, Scott. Sorry.
Hi.
Hello, everyone.
And here comes Christine. So I'll wait a second. And if there are any questions now about anything to do with the course, then let me know. I know one or two of you are still having trouble getting the book, or it hasn't arrived. But I've been scanning the chapters, and I think you've been receiving them from Barbara. So again, if there's any problems like that, please let me know. I'll let Barbara know. Okay, I think I'll put you into rooms now. There are how many? 15, so 5 rooms of 3 each. And as I say, think of questions that you would like to ask in the open session, and we'll take it from there. Okay, ready to go? Okay, let's see. How many did I say? Okay, there you go. So I'll see you back here in 10 minutes. I'll give you a 1-minute warning. Hi there, how are we? Was that long enough?
It's never long enough, Scott.
Let's, before I kind of move into presentation mode, let's hear from you what some of the issues that came up and any questions you'd like to address me let's see, who didn't I visit? Ruthie, what did you talk about?
We talked a lot. I was in a group with Girish and Fabio, and Girish and I are in similar situations in that we started learning languages to communicate with our in-laws and become a part of a different discourse community. And that was the part of the chapter that struck us, I guess. One of the quotes was, language learning is a process of becoming, not getting, becoming a member of a discourse community. So we talked about that. Ellis said that acquisition occurs in interaction rather than as a result of. And I personally wondered about the boys in the seashell story that was in the chapter, because they didn't come to any conclusion or solve the seashell problem, but yet this was important, right? So I guess the way they interacted was language learning. They used what? They used good language to interact with each other, with the shell, with the teacher. And even though they didn't find a solution, they grew as language learners.
Yes, I mean, I think actually what's interesting about that extract, although it's not about language learning per se, it's about learning about science. So, you know, how these concepts are jointly constructed, the way that through talk, through the talk that's in a sense scaffolded by the teacher asking the kind of questions that help them construct their developing awareness. So it's first of all, I think it's a very Vygotskian idea where learning is scaffolded through interaction and that it's jointly constructed. And although, yeah, you say they don't get to any conclusion, I mean, this is only an extract, and I think Neil Mercer's term, the long conversation, captures, I think, quite nicely the idea that learning is a long conversation. It takes time, and it's sort of incremental over not just an individual lesson, but over several lessons. And these constructs become clearer as the more that the learners engage with them. And what's interesting actually about this now in retrospect is, I'll talk about it in a minute, the importance of things, of material things in learning. And there's a whole new development I've just been reading. I mean, literally, I'm trying to catch up with it, which is looking at how materials or matter, anything, whether it's print materials or whether it's actual things like seashells or whatever, are a really vital part in constructing knowledge. And in fact, and I'll post a link to this if you're able to access academic journals, but the Modern Language Journal, which I subscribe to, the latest, it's a supplement. I literally got it this week, so I've only just read the introduction, but it's called, the subject is Materials Use Across Diverse Contexts of Language Learning and Teaching. So it's looking at materials, but in the big sense of materials, that are not just print materials and course books, etc., but all the kinds of things that are that could be in the classroom, and particularly related to language learning, and also outside the classroom. And there's an article here in this collection about using augmented reality apps on mobile phones when students are outside, and using these as a tool for learning. So there's a whole, and I think I actually posted, I think it was in response to a post, and it was in an earlier forum. I think it was Carrie. I responded, but it's an extract also from a very recent issue of a journal, the TESOL Quarterly, on what are called new materialisms. So this is it's analogous to new literacies, but new materialisms is a kind of development in education which looks at the kind of bigger picture. And she says, or they say, this is an article about some work being done in Spain, in fact, in sort of defining, they say the key idea in new materialisms is that human living, thinking, and acting are always material, just as the material is also semiotic. Semiotic means that it has meaning potential. From the angle of new materialisms, the availability and arrangements of material and spatial resources are not external to or independent of the linguistic and non-linguistic behaviors comprised in learning. So if you get the idea, it's like, it's not like there's the learner and the teacher and then there's the materials. They're all entangled, and they use the expression entangled quite a lot. So it's like, I've been using the expression embedded, that language is embedded in its particular context. And so these contexts include the material things in that context, and they're just as important in a sense as part of helping construct learning. And so this is a brand new idea in terms of language teaching. As I say, it's only within the last 2 or 3 weeks that I've been reminded of this, and it has been around a bit longer than that. But going back to the video that I asked you to look at, that Dev Roy video about the birth of a word, you can see that concept very much there of the physical context, including the kitchen and the water in the kitchen and the nanny and the whole complex relationship between all these different ingredients in the learning situation. So although Dev Roy, when he did that, didn't refer to new materialisms or what's also called socio-materialism, it's very much, I think, demonstrated in that particular context. I'm not really answering your question, Ruth, about the seashells, but when I found that extract and put it in the article, I had no, I had no notion of the importance of or the work that's been done on the effect of material objects in terms of, so it's both the material objects, but also the scaffolded talk between the teacher and the students, and the students interacting between themselves to kind of construct these different categories for seashells. But you can see, I'll show you an example in a minute of it working in a language classroom where 2 learners, through gesture, help construct a concept which one of them is having trouble with. But thanks, Ruthie, for that. Anything else you want to add while you're there, while you've got your mic on?
Just everything you just said, a teacher of young learners would agree wholeheartedly.
Absolutely.
We're all about things,
Exactly.
among other things, lots of things.
Exactly. I'm not telling, exactly. Teachers of young learners know not only about the importance of objects and things, but of also of gesture and action and doing things like action songs or games, heads and, what is it? Heads and hands and fingers, heads and toes. And so important. And the question is, of course, to what extent can we transfer this into more adult learning, or, and thereby hangs a tale. And we'll come back to some of these applications and implications shortly. Can anybody else would like to report on their group? Anne, whose group were you in? You're off. Sorry. No? Can't. Okay, fine. Cecilia.
Yeah. My connection is, can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I was with Margaret and Lee, yeah. And I think we mentioned similar things. Lee also, okay, right. Lee added the fact that she is in Italy and the gestures are really, you know, really important there. And I asked her if there was, if gestures really play an important role in Italy, or if it was a stereotype, you know.
Mhm.
But she said that it does play rightly. I think she can talk about that more. We both, I think all of us found the gestures, the body language really interesting from the chapter.
Yes. Yeah. You talked about that too, Fabio. Yeah. It's
Being
interesting.
Italian, you know.
Go on. Yeah.
Yeah, because I asked. I mean, it's interesting because in Italy, we're kind of known for using our hands, and I don't know if this is a stereotype, or if it's something. Is it connected to culture? Is it connected to the way we think, or because Ruth mentioned that it's our brain who's working there and is taking the pressure off by using, you know, by using gestures. So I said that English people, for example, people from the UK don't do it as much, and I was wondering if it's a matter of culture or a matter of how our brain works. That's the
Yes, that's a really interesting question, and it has been researched extensively. I mean, there's a long tradition of. I have a book I found. Where is it? An ancient book published in the States in 1968 called A Gesture Inventory for the Teaching of Spanish. So the idea is that if you're learning Spanish, you need to learn the gestures that go with it. So and that it's the drawings are absolutely terrible for some reason. But if you can see, there's a gesture here, this one, for saying of somebody that they're crazy, yeah? So it's a gesture for madness, and also to gesture about somebody that they're stubborn. You know, so these kinds of books of typology of gestures tend to be looking at things that are culturally specific to a particular culture. They're sometimes called emblems, and they're used often to replace speech. So, you know, like the thumbs up, for example, which is common to many cultures, but not all cultures. But you can use that instead of speech if you want to. And of course, we know that lots of emojis and that represent different kinds of gestures like that. And of course, there's problems with these because sometimes they are culturally specific, and some, you know, to one, they're not recognized, but more dangerously, they might have a completely different meaning in another culture. So there's those kinds of gestures, sometimes called emblems. They're emblematic of a particular thing. But there are a lot of other kinds of gestures, like, you know, that, which, or beats, when, you know, you see politicians doing, when they're, you know, giving a speech, you see a lot of politicians doing this thing called a beat, which is to add extra emphasis while they're speaking. So most gesture is co-expressive. That's the term. It is done in conjunction and often a tiny little bit ahead of speech. And in the presentation, I'll show you a list of the different kinds of typologies, of 4 or 5 different gestures. There's also things like deictics, pointing gestures. And so one of the first things that children learn to recognize is their parents pointing. Yeah? And that's a sign, yeah, a pre-linguistic kind of understanding. And they learn to do that too before they can speak. And arguably, we're the only animal that recognizes pointing, although dog owners assure me that dogs can recognize a pointed finger, and that's possibly true. But coming back to Fabio's point and the point that Cecilia was making about Italians, of course, yes, it is It is a fact that Italians are known for gesticulating more than gesturing. And I think there's the study shows that everybody gestures, basically. Some people more than others, and some cultures more expansively than others. So, for example, but the same kinds of gestures exist in different cultures. And I think the thing that distinguishes Italians classically, although again, you've got to be beware of stereotyping, is that what's called the gestural space, the space within which they gesture, is larger typically than, say, Japanese speakers, who have a smaller gestural space. But that doesn't mean to say that there aren't Japanese speakers who, when they speak, who do use a large gestural space, just as, different people speak louder and softer in their own, within a culture, within a linguistic community. So there's a huge range within the community. And I'm sure there's Italians who have a very small gestural space too. But on the whole, it's probably true that Italians and some certain other languages tend to use a more expansive gestural space, but the same kinds of gestures within that space. So beats and what are called sometimes iconic gestures, things that represent an idea, like the whole world, which is a universal, or things are getting better, going up, or things are going down, etc. These things that tend to be universals. How expansive we are, of course, as I say, it's an individual thing. Christine, you got your hand up.
Yeah, so initially I had the question that I addressed to members of our group who are from southern countries like Italy, Spain, Brazil. So how do they adapt their body language, and do they really do it? So when they teach people from other nationalities, so do they still retain it as part of their cultural identity, or do they still adapt it a little bit? Like if they teach, I don't know, Japanese students, for instance. So to which extent? And as far as I understood from the answers in the chat, mostly they retain their gestures. So
yes, this is really interesting. This also has been researched, and the relationship between thinking and gesturing and thinking in different languages. So it's not just about how expansive you are. So when you're learning Italian, that you become very expansive with your hands. The fact is, first of all, that learners do tend to gesture more in a second language than in their first language, because one of the functions of gesture is to communicate. And so if you're stuck for a word, it also has a pragmatic function to, you don't want to lose the turn, but you're trying to think of the word. So you maintain the turn by gesturing. And the other thing is that, what was I going to say? Learners, so buying time, representing things that they can't explain with words. And also, this notion that the more effort you're putting into communicating, you need to kind of offload, or the more cognitive effort involved, you need to offload some of that effort into your body, as it were. So this seems to be why when people are learning things, often by heart, I'm thinking of sort of Quranic chanting, it's often accompanied by movement. And you see people, I see students preparing for their exam, university students walking, in a park, walking around, they're memorizing, and they're gesturing while they're memorizing it, or they're beating, and it seems to be able to help. So there's all these different reasons why learners may, in fact, gesture more than in their second language than in their first language. Now, the other interesting thing that they've found with gesture is, okay, let me explain this. Correct me if I'm wrong, James, but in German and Dutch, there's no single word for put. So if you're putting something, you either lay it, legen, or you stand it, stehen. So, and it depends on the kind of object. So if you're putting a bottle on a table, you would use correct me, James, I'm stehen, yeah? I stand the bottle on the table. Or if you're putting a book on the table, you say, I lay the book on the table. And the same in Dutch, apparently. Now, when German speakers or Dutch speakers are gesturing to put something, they show whether they're using stehen or legen by the shape of their hand, yeah? So it's for standing, the gesture is like that. For laying, it's something else. Whereas in English, because we have the all-purpose word put, when we say put, we don't discriminate in the gesture. Now, how do they know this? Well, what they do is they show people short movies like Tom and Jerry cartoons, and then they get them to tell the story. And they don't say to them, you've got to gesture when you tell it, but they film them when they're telling the story. And inevitably, many of the people they're interviewing gesture. And so when something they're describing put, if they're an English speaker, they'll just put it. If they're a German or a Dutch speaker and they're speaking German and Dutch, they'll show the putting gesture more specifically according to whether it's standing or laying. Now, here's the interesting thing. When a Dutch speaker or German speaker is learning English, they'll retain those shapes, even though they're saying put. Yeah, I put the bottle on the table, or I lay the book on the table, but they'll still say, they'll use the gesture with put at the beginning. But over time, their gestures start to sort of flatten out and they just use the standard put gesture. They don't distinguish. So what's happening here is that it seems to be cognitively, they're adjusting their mindset to English away from the mother tongue, which does seem to suggest we do think in our first language, even when we're speaking our second language, up to a point. When you get really advanced, you start to think in the second language, and that's demonstrated with gestures. Now, isn't that interesting? I mean, I think that's really interesting. Now, how broadly it applies, of course, is another thing, but that's where the research into cognitive linguistics is leading us, and it's really into understanding more about cognition in different languages. So, sorry, James, you had your hand up.
Yeah.
Was I correct?
Yeah.
Was it?
Yeah, I think in High German we would say stellen rather than stehen, but it's the same thing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But that's just a minor point. The point is valid. And to underline it, I wanted to tell one of two anecdotes. My colleague Peter lived in several years in Japan, and he knew he was getting good in Japanese when he was doing all the bowing on the telephone. Okay, so just sort of the opposite of your example of losing the gesture going into English. He was gaining the gestures, the bowing, when the person wasn't even in front of him.
Absolutely.
And the second story is one of my own, is that I wouldn't limit this to gesture at all. I'd limit to other things, or I'd expand it to other things like tone of voice. When I was studying at a French university, I tried to mimic as much as I could the people around me and took on their voice intonations, which was a bit louder and faster than where I come from in Minnesota, different endings on the phrases. And it seems that I felt angry all the time, or ornery, irritated all the time. And it took me a while to figure out that the way the French speak normally is the way in Minnesota that we show irritation or something, by speaking a bit louder, a bit faster, and these sort of intonation patterns match with irritation in Minnesota, where I come from. And it took me several weeks to realize why I was so angry all the time.
Well, great stories, James. Just going back to the first one about bowing on the phone, and that is interesting. Not just, I mean, why do we gesture on the phone, whether it's bowing or what? Well, when somebody's on the phone, and why do we gesture in the dark when nobody can see us? And why do people with blind people gesture, even when they're talking to other blind people? And this goes back to the origins of gesture. And some argue that it's pre-linguistic. Before language was developed, we communicated more by our hands. Other people argue no, that the two things developed together. But the thing is, they're inextricably linked in the mind. And in fact, the part of the brain, if there is a part of the brain, which is the language part, is very close to the hand part, which would seem to argue again that gesture and language are intimately connected. They're part of what one writer calls a coupled system. It's a coupled system. So, and the other thing about it, coming back to your second point story, is that it's intimately related to pronunciation. So, and in fact, sometimes things like intonation and gesture are just bundled together as paralinguistics. Yeah, the things that are on top of or beside or above words that or non-verbal language. But intonation is, in a sense, a kind of gesturing with your tongue, if you like, or gesturing with your vocal cords, and it goes hand in hand. And stress, when we stress things, we tend to beat with the stress. Yeah, it's another way of emphasizing this. So they're intimately connected, and this, of course, has implications in terms of teaching, particularly teaching and pronunciation. I'll come to that shortly. But there's a guy called Bill Acton who's does a lot of work. I've seen workshops of his on pronunciation. He's based in the States, and his whole system of teaching pronunciation is combining voice and gesture, what he calls haptics. So it's a really interesting application of some of this research that's being done. Yes, Anna-Marie, your tone actually had effect on the way you felt to James, exactly. And that, again, comes back to this question of whether languages do have their own system, and that learning a language, you have to, and of course it raises the other question, which is related to pronunciation too. With English as an international language, do we have to learn the pronunciation and the gestures of English as a native language, or is that, icing on the cake in a sense? Is it unnecessary? Carrie?
Yeah, we've been having interesting discussions about international English and whether we should be, as a global platform, we should be putting out British English or American English or international English. But I do think particularly some of those things that can get students into trouble are really important. So the that I've written earlier on is, as a Brit, the way that we gesture to with our hands is really important in Britain. And I know in the States it's not so much, but in New Zealand, I think in Australia is similar to in the UK, that if you show to with your knuckles, I can't even do it, I know you're uncomfortable, but if you show to with your knuckles facing this way, it's like showing one with your knuckle facing this way. So in terms of those, I often teach that class of, like, when students are saying, can I have two, whatever it is, in the UK, you definitely need to show either the victory or the I'm cute sign. But I think that's a really important learning point for students to know, that because in Spain they can say two, no problem. But I'm like, ooh, making sure that you're teaching not only the language, but also the culture.
Absolutely. There's a funny, actually, I just remember a story too. This happened to me in Barcelona in the market, Santa Catalina market. I was ordering 3 of something, and I put up my hand like this to order the 3, and the butcher was he said to me, he said, he checked, he said, did you put up 3 fingers like that or 3 fingers like that? And I think, and he said, there's a scene in a movie. What is it? It's in Django.
No, it's in Spiritual Bastards, which is the Quentin Tarantino one, where they know that he's German because he does this or he does this.
Exactly. So he's trying to disguise the fact that he's German. His German is absolutely impeccable, no accent or anything, but he makes a gesture, which, etc. So that's a dead giveaway. Yes, I thought so. The butcher told me the story in Spanish about this gesturing, and he was just amused because he thought perhaps it was something to do with my native language, etc. Fantastic. I'd forgotten all about that. Thanks for reminding me.
Yeah. But I also think, and then again, I come from an online background, and gestures are changing as we're teaching online. So I tutor coaches because when we're having these conversations, and we often want to say, yes, right, I agree. And we often want to support the language of somebody by doing that, like, confirmation language. Whereas when you're online and you have these slight digital delays, I want to kind of lessen that oral vocal support and do it more with gestures. And particularly when we're looking at the cameras of everybody, we're not looking around as much. We've got much more focus on the face, and so we can see those gestures. So when we're online, I think we do more gestures, more silent, non-verbal gestures.
Well, this is interesting. And the group, one of the groups I was joined, we're talking about exactly that. So what's the application of all this to online teaching? And I think there's a particular challenge. I'm saying there's probably a lot of research already being done as we speak as to the effect of gesture, gaze, what happens when your webcam is off, what effect of that does that have, particularly in language learning in terms of engagement, etc. But also, and something I've learned is to talking about the gestural space is to remind myself that the gestural space is much more limited online. And if you're gesturing down here, nobody can see you. So you've got to do it up here. And for all those effects. And then also what's really interesting from a language teaching point of view is if students don't gesture when they're doing, if they don't gesture when they're doing a speaking task, for example, they tend to be rated lower in terms of their fluency in the task than if they gesture. Now, I can't give you chapter and verse of the research that was done on this. I wish I could find it because, and I'm pretty sure it exists, but they did a study where they had students doing the same task, and one they were told not to gesture, to put their hands, sit on their hands, and the other one they were allowed to gesture. And although they were doing exactly the same task and the language was identical and both more or less, they were rated higher in terms of fluency when they were gesturing. So, which runs against a tradition in my education, at least, where we were discouraged in our first language for gesturing in class, told to sit on our hands, which seems to be a terribly cruel thing to do. And actually it's counterproductive because gesturing does seem to give the effect that you are more fluent. Any other points? I'm conscious that the hour is up, but we're going to run on for 30 minutes. I do have a presentation, but I can easily record it. There's a couple of things I would like to show you. So let me just do that. And if we've still got time at the end for more discussion, then we'll go for it. I don't want to take up too much of this valuable discussion time. I mean, just to summarize, I think some of the points in the book, the idea that there's a mind-body separation has been very important in 20th century, or more than 20th century, in the last several centuries, particularly since René Descartes, the French philosopher, drew attention to what you call the mind-body separation. I think, therefore I am, but the rest of my body is kind of, it just carries my brain around kind of thing. Whereas more recently, people have started looking at the fact that we're a more integrated, that the mind-body distinction is a false one in a sense, and that better to construe the brain and the body as being intimately connected. And also the whole point of the embeddedness theory is that the brain and the body are also connected to the world. So this is the quote. Yes, this is the quote in the book, in the chapter, brains are in bodies, bodies in the world, and meaningful action, which happens to be the title of the book we're using happily, in these worlds is in large part socially constructed and conducted. And you could add not just socially constructed, but sort of physically, tactically, if you like, constructed and conducted. So that's the premise. And the notion that this notion of embodied mind comes from cognitive linguistics. And we were talking about that with Christine and Anna Maria in a group. And cognitive linguistics is a kind of new kid on the block in terms of theories of language. And I'll give you some links. There's a very good series of videos, lectures about cognitive linguistics, very accessible on YouTube. And I'll put a link up in the forum. But basically the idea is that in cognitive linguistics, and it goes way back to anthropologists who study language in the wild, as it were. And Malinowski said, ultimately, all the meaning of all words is derived from bodily experience. Now, this was pre-cognitive linguistics in a sense as a science, but he intuited that from studying Polynesian, Melanesian people in their physical environment. And so the basic premise of cognitive linguistics is language is rooted in human experience. And so that example of up in my chapter is just one of countless examples of showing how our experience of the world is reflected in the language. So we grow up, and as we grow up, we think of up as being generally a positive thing, whereas being down or falling down, etc., is a negative thing, and that is reflected right through the language in metaphorical uses too. So that we use phrasal verbs, for example, with up and down and other prepositions to express metaphorically concepts that are related originally to how those prepositions were used to describe places. And of course, time, when you think about it, time, we use the same prepositions for time as we do for space. But why is it, at 3 o'clock, but in January, etc., is because we construe January as a kind of container, whereas at 3 o'clock as a point. And so we use the same prepositions we talk about with containers, as we, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That cognitive linguistics, here's a very good book introduction if you're interested to it, very readable, and its relation to English language teaching. And again, is a summary of the same point I'm making. And I just want to, this is actually was the book that started me thinking about all this. I just picked it up at a secondhand bookstall in Manhattan. It's one of Johnson, along with Lakoff, one of the original, in a sense, architects of the whole notion of cognitive grammar, cognitive linguistics, and they've written extensively on how we categorize things, for example. I want to just introduce you to this guy, because he should be better known, Jean-Remy Lapeyre. He's a French academic, and he produced a book on English grammar through movement. And he's got a number of videos, and if I can just show you, unfortunately, it's not translated. And if I just show you a clip of one of his, hang on. Is this going to work? Will you, if I click on this link, will you see it? Can you see that?
I think you have to exit your presentation mode
and
open up the video separate.
Okay, let's see. Oh, here we go.
Have you ever? Yes, I have.
Can you see that? Hear it?
We can hear it, but we can't see it.
Oh no.
Scott, you have shared only a particular screen. Presentation and then reshare that tab of your.
Hang on, let me try again. Do I need to open the thing in? Have you ever? Whoops.
If you've got it on a tab in your browser, you should be able to share that tab.
If I do what?
Yeah, now we can see it.
You can?
Now we can see it.
That's it.
Okay, I'll just go back. If I go in full screen, can you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now we can't hear it.
No, but he's not speaking.
Okay, that's why.
Have you ever?
Yeah.
Yes, I have. Have you ever? No, I haven't. Present perfect. Vivre, c'est accumuler de l'expérience. On a fait ceci, on a fait cela.
Have you ever? T'invite à regarder.
Okay, so you get the idea. Hang on, just let me turn that off.
Have you ever been to America? Si c'est oui, tu réponds.
God. Okay. Okay. Okay, so you get the idea, yeah? Now, can you hear me? I'll just turn him off. Okay, here we go. So the whole of the grammar of English, or a lot of it, is acted or demonstrated or gestured, or it's danced, actually. These are professional mimes or dancers, and you get the idea here is that he's demonstrating the concept of the present perfect by reaching into his past, looking for the experience, and then bringing it out. And either he has the experience, so have you been to New York? I'm searching in my past and I bring out the experience. Yes, I have. Yeah. Or have you been to Swaziland? No, I haven't. Yeah. So it's, to me, that's one of the best ways I ever seen of getting the concept of the present perfect out, the idea of an experience that you have. So it's in the past, but you have it. And this is what's interesting about cognitive linguistics. It's not an accident that we use the verb to have in the present perfect, because it's something we have physically. Just like the prepositions are used metaphorically to talk about time, we use verbs metaphorically to talk, in this case, about experience. So, so what's interesting, as I say, is this whole book is based on these kind of cognitive linguistic or cognitive grammar view of gesture or of language, and using gesture to demonstrate that, or using body movement to demonstrate that. So just and he even if you can't get hold of the book, and there's not much point if really if you don't speak French, except as a curiosity. The link there will take you to a number of YouTube videos of different tenses and things from that same book. And so what he says, his summarizing comment here, is language is not only about expressing meaning, but it's about shaping meaning and performing meaning. And I think that has kind of powerful implications. So that's the notion of the mind and the body being a coupled system. And then the body and the world, and the mind and the body and the world, is the notion of embeddedness. And of course, again, this goes back to the notion of situated learning, so that learning is situated, and it's all about participation in a community of practice. It's about, as you said, it's about becoming rather than having. We don't have language, we become members of a particular community, in Diane Larson Freeman's way of putting it. And this kind of predates the notion of the embedded mind, but I think it's consistent with it, the situated learning, that all learning in a sense is situated, and particularly language learning. And they go on to say in this book, a learning curriculum is essentially situated, is not something that can be considered in isolation. A learning curriculum is thus characteristic of a community. You cannot, separate the dancer from the dance, kind of thing. And this also connects with the view of language use as being a kind of ecological phenomenon, and therefore language learning is equally ecological. And Leo Van Leer has written a whole book about the ecology and semiotics of language learning. So he says here, we need to look at the entire situation So this is, again, very consistent with what I've been reading about the socio-materialism. It's not just the learner, it's not just the teacher, it's the whole complex of things and materials, etc., and the learner and the teacher. We need to look at the environment. How does learning come about? So an ecological view involves the study of context. In addition, things are happening all the time in schools, classrooms, at desks, and around computers. So ecology is also a study of movement, process, and action. And these are, this is Earl Stevick, process as opposed to product, meaningful action as opposed to simply thinking, movement as opposed to cognition. And one of the concepts, of course, in an ecological approach is this notion of affordances, the different affordances provided by the ecology, by the environment. So Van Leer uses the example of a leaf. So for a leaf, for a caterpillar, offers food, but for some birds, it offers shelter or a nest, and it offers protection for others, etc. So the leaf, the same thing essentially, but it offers different affordances. And similarly, we saw the example, I think, of Van Leer and his son in the supermarket. There was an affordance offered for language when his son was learning his first language. And Van Leer quotes this writer to the effect that the affordance perspective assumes an active learner establishing relationships with and within the environment. And he goes on to say, in terms of language learning, affordances arise out of participation, again, so situated learning, participation, becoming part of a community of practice, and learning opportunities arise as a consequence. And Van Leer uses the example of kids learning to play football, he says it's experiential. They start kicking the ball around and the kind of rules establish themselves. But there's not to say that they don't already have some idea of what the rules are through having watched football, etc. So it's a combination of learned behavior and experiential behavior. The rules of the game become learnable in an interaction between discovery, by just kicking the ball around, and it starts to become more systematic, and then top-down instruction, which could be jointly constructed, as in the seashells example, or it could be done through a coach or a parent or whatever, telling them how to play it. But it's an interaction between these different levels. And he says the same thing happens with language. Language learning emerges from participation in linguistic practices. And that is where I wanted you, that links to the video of the TED Talk, which to me is a powerful example, as I said, of how language learning is, the first language is contextualized, situated, jointly constructed, or constructed, scaffolded by better others, etc. And so those wordscapes, whatever they call those word landscapes that are different for every word, seems to be a very powerful way of showing how language learning is connected intimately to the environment. And of course, the second language just as much, one could argue. And this takes me back to a study that was done many years ago of immigrant children in the States in playground situations by Lucy Wong Fillmore. And so what she was doing was she was looking at how these children linguistically, but also physically and socially integrated into the community of practice, which is the playground with native speaker English children. And she identified some strategies that they used to become, to access the second language. And these are actually, she didn't say it in this study, but these are just as much physical as social. Join a group and act as if you understand what's going on, even if you don't. This was a strategy that the better kids, these are 9, 10-year-old kids, used. And give the impression with a few well-chosen words that you can speak the language. Count on your friends for help. So she devised these social strategies and then from the cognitive strategies. But even the cognitive strategies are kind of participatory, like C2, get some expressions you understand and start talking, and so on. So that, again, this would seem to reinforce the view that learning is embedded in physical, social contexts, which has implications, of course, for both classroom teaching and online teaching. One of the implications has been the language in the wild movement, learning language in the wild. I've talked about this before, I'm sure, maybe on the dogma course, but where learners who want to learn, for example, a Scandinavian language, go to the country where it's being taught. They do go to classrooms, but they also have tasks which take them out into the street, for example, buying pastry. But while they're in that pastry shop situation, the woman behind the counter has been instructed not to revert to English when the students come in, which would be the natural tendency, but to stick to Icelandic. And so what happens is they go and they have this interaction, they film the interaction, they take photos of bits and pieces of language around in the context, they take these back to the classroom, and they kind of jointly talk about this experience and then prepare for the next one. And it's because this is obviously, makes so much sense if you're learning particularly a minority, in a sense, language like Icelandic or Finnish or whatever, to go to the place where it's spoken, because it's different implications for English. And if you're in an EFL context, like Japan, for example, where students don't necessarily have the opportunity to learn English in the wild. I'll run on, but I mean, this is from their website, a little bit of the background to this approach, but they do emphasize in the second half of the quote that it doesn't mean that it's only experiential outside the class learning, it's combined with the classroom. The classroom is a place where they prepare for these encounters, but also where they share notes on what happened in the wild. And a number of researchers have written very interesting papers looking at little interactions in these kinds of in the wild situations. So that's the notion of language learning being embedded in its particular contexts. And then the notion, perhaps the harder one to grasp, is this notion of that the mind is not just this kind of thing that we carry around in our head, but it extends into our body. And there's a nice analogy for that, which is I don't know whether you ever saw this, I'm talking of movies, a movie called Memento, where this guy, I can't remember his name, is losing his memory, but he was witness to a crime, and the only way he can retain the memory of the crime is to tattoo key words onto his body. So he's using his body, in a sense, as a kind of notepad. But we do this all the time. Our cognition is extended into our body when we do things like key in our, bank PIN code. That I notice that when I key in my code in the gym, my fingers are starting to do the talking, in a sense, before I even get to the machine. And if I think about it too hard, I can actually not remember. It's better just to let the fingers do the tapping in. I think we've all experienced that. And people who study things like how musicians become so skilled is because they offload a lot of the cognitive work into their hands, or calligraphers that you do the same thing, that they learn how to, the hand follows the movement without any thought. And this has been, they've looked at how children learn maths, and studies have shown that if children gesture when they're learning different mathematical functions like addition or subtraction, multiplication, etc., or they have longer, more complex sums, by gesturing, it supports the actual learning behavior. So showing the connections between things has positive impact on learning. And so, of course, this brings us to the whole question that we're talking about gesture. What does gesture do for a learner learning a language? And one way helps them chunk the information. So even if they don't have much syntax, they can show through gesture how their utterance is, in a sense, organized into subject, verb, and object, if you like. And it reduces ambiguity, increases redundancy. So it's important when, again, the learner doesn't have a lot of language, they can clarify what they're saying, and they can manage turn taking. There's a pragmatic function to gesture. It's well known, it's well been studied in conversation, when you maintain your turn in a conversation by keeping your shoulders raised and by looking away from the person you're speaking to. And when you've come to the end of the turn, you look at this person you're speaking to, you drop your shoulders and your eyebrows, etc. And that signals that you're done, as well as the intonation, of course, is again where gesture and intonation are intimately connected. It can be used as a communication strategy when you don't know the words, or you don't know the word for corkscrew, you can use a gesture, of course. And this whole thing we talked about of reducing cognitive load through gesture, and then demonstrating empathy was one of the reasons perhaps why people are rated as being more fluent when they gesture. Let me just kind of run on a bit and talk about, this is a lovely study I wrote up. Well, this look fun. I didn't do the research, but I co-wrote the article, and I'll give you the reference at the end. There's Christine Jacknick, who did the research. This was for her doctorate. She video recorded masses of classroom interaction, and has been using it ever since. And this was one tiny little piece where the students have got the sentence, she quit, what was it? It's a structure, the difference between she stopped to smoke and she stopped smoking. And one of them has got it, and he's explaining it to Nobu, who's kind of understand it, and he's explaining it to Rodrigo, the other student in the pair. That's the teacher standing slightly obscuring. So these are drawings based on the video. And Nobu is explaining, I stopped to smoke means I stopped and he's beating with each word, and then I smoked, yeah? And he uses a smoking gesture, an emblematic one for smoking. And Rodrigo picks this up. He says, okay, so we're using another example. In the first one, you were walking, and he does the gesture of walking, and then you stopped. He does the same gesture, and you lit up a cigarette. So he stopped to smoke. Yeah, he was walking and he stopped to smoke. So what happens here is that Rodrigo, who wasn't following very well initially, this concept, picks it up through echoing the gestures of Nobu. And it's a nice little bit of very fine-grained research into the way language, gesture, and so, going back to the seashells example in the article, the kind of same thing is happening where the learning is being co-constructed in this zone of proximal development. I mean, it's a physical zone of proximal development, and the teacher is nodding and encouraging while they kind of do this. So these are some of the implications and applications, I think. In terms of comprehension, teachers who gesture more tend to be better understood, which again has implications for online. And learners who gesture are perhaps more intelligible to each other. So it helps in comprehension, it helps in production, and it helps memory. And we'll see in a minute how that's done. So this is from a book on classroom management, the kinds of gestures, and teachers who have consistent gestures in their classes tend to, it's been shown, well, that was the quote, I think it's in the article as well, a huge body of research associates teachers' non-verbal immediacy cues with increases in affective, cognitive, and behavioral learning outcomes. Again, has implications, of course, for online learning, because all this research was done in physical classrooms. But they've been across, this is not just language teachers, but across all kinds of teachers, increases in affective, cognitive, and behavioral learning outcomes in various settings. And these are some of the gestures. As teacher trainers, perhaps we might want to remind teachers that they should learn. And this is the guy I'm telling you, using pronunciation, teaching pronunciation through different gestures, this whole system that he's developed. And the link is there. And it's not just for teaching super segmental features of pronunciation like intonation and word stress, but also the difference between different vowels and relating the parts of the hand to the vowel quadrant, you know, the a, e, or how they're distributed, etc. Very interesting, and I've seen them demonstrated, and it's quite compelling. Lynn Stromberg, who wrote that book on prepositions that Anna Maria just showed me, and Boers did work on retention when students acted or mimed out verbs, verbs of movement, but also phrasal verbs. And we've seen, again, going back to Lapierre and his wonderful work on English grammar and movement. In another book by Randall Holm on cognitive linguistics, he talks about the use of gesture to get across concepts like a cup of coffee. I can't remember, I think that's the gesture. And a cup for coffee. So again, looking at the prepositions and showing physically how they differ. So you can then transfer that into more metaphorical use, a friend of Kim's or a friend for Kim. And we can, work's been done on phrasal verbs, as I say, the difference between drink it and drink it up for completion, or write it and write it down. And if students do the gesture when they're learning the phrasal verb, they show better effects for learning, but not just for these literal ones, but the more metaphorical ones. Also, of course, the difference between aspect, I love it, or I'm loving it. I'm sure we all do have a gesture to show sort of progressive. He works a lot, he's working a lot, that kind of thing. And it will rain, pitching the event into the disconnected future, and it's going to rain, showing it connected somehow to the present. And similarly, we saw with the difference between I went to China and I've been to China. Alignment, proximity is all part of it, and learners learn better doing tasks where they can be physically aligned, and work has been done on that. This is kind of interesting. This is a chain of charter schools in the States. They have these rules called the slant rules, where learners have to sit up. You can't slouch. You have to listen. You have to ask questions. And these are particularly interesting. The nod. Yeah. So you nod when you understand. And that is kind of interesting that nodding as a behavior when you're a learner can help you track the learning trajectory in a sense. And it's certainly true as a teacher or as a speaker at conferences that if somebody's sitting there nodding, not nodding off, nodding in the audience, then they're much more likely to attract your attention as a teacher, and it sort of sends a positive message back. So the idea is that if learners nod frequently, then they will learn better, and track the speaker with your eyes. Movement in the classroom, getting students up and moving, of course, and then in terms of research, a lot of research now moving towards looking not just at what people say when they're learning, but how they interact physically, how they align with each other, say, for example, in group work. Another problem, of course, with online learning. So just to finish everything, just a nice quote from Eva Hoffman's wonderful memoir on how she learned English as a teenager in Canada, Polish immigrant. She says, she quotes at one point in this book, "My mother says I'm becoming English. This hurts me because I know she means I'm becoming cold. I'm no colder than I've ever been, but I'm learning to be less demonstrative." This is this idea, again, coming back to those original points we're talking about Italians, etc., that perhaps in Polish you gesture more, but in English you gesture less, or the gestural space is smaller. And the teacher is telling her to sit on her hands and then try talking, to not rely on gesture. And so she's becoming, it's reflected, her mother sees it as her becoming more English and colder, therefore. And then when she does learn English, she uses a lovely image here. She says, now the language has entered my body, has incorporated itself in the softest tissue of my being, which I think captures really nicely the way that language is kind of a physical thing as much as a mental thing. So that's the reference to the article I wrote with Christine Jacknick. If you're interested, I can make a copy. Very difficult to get, but I'll finish there. And I appreciate we're just actually out of time, but if there's any immediate questions or comments, then I'll take them. Yes, James.
Yeah, I've got a comment. One of my students had a baby a year ago, and she did something with the child called baby signing, something she picked up from the States. And what she does is she gestures, makes certain signs like in sign language when she's talking to her child, and the child learns to sign back before the child can speak. So they've got sort of their private idiomatic little sign language. It's not replacing anything. It's just going along with the child's normal verbal development. But she said it's been very interesting to observe how the child has been able to communicate to her before she actually started speaking.
Wow, that's amazing. That is amazing. I'm just trying to relate that, because also there are a lot of, there's a whole other field that we haven't talked about, which is signing and its relation to gesture, etc. And how, but signing is interesting because it's a whole system, obviously, it's a language, but people apparently gesture as they sign. So there's a distinction between doing the sign for whatever it is, like water, and then doing it with a gesture to add emphasis. So you can do beats when you're signing, just as you can with physical. So they're two quite separate, well, coupled again, a coupled system, just as spoken language and gesture are a coupled system. So is signing and gesture. So they're not two different things, or they're not the same thing, but they work intimately together. So but that's very interesting. James, thanks for that. Any other comments? What I'll do yes, Carrie.
Oh, no, I mean, when you do your follow-up, or if you do your follow-up thing, I'd like to know more about the porous classroom, or if you could point us in the direction of some more research. That was a comment right at the very end that was like, oh, that sounds really interesting. I want to know more about that.
Exactly, and I think particularly now we haven't really developed the implications in terms of online, and maybe I'll set that as a kind of discussion topic in the forum. How can we make the online classroom more a more physical learning space in a sense, and how can what are the implications of the notion of a porous classroom, connecting the classroom with the outside world. And, when we get back to classrooms, those of us who still haven't, what learning affordances can we exploit in the real classroom, even with adults? It's not just about kids playing with things, but, when you think of, we haven't talked about total physical response. Total physical response, of course, is language and action. And I mean, it's learning language through actions, and it works great for kids, the Simon Says kind of routines, but it does seem to have some payoff for adults too, if they buy into it. I've had resistance. I used to do it a lot. I got one student who really resisted and thought it was infantile to be standing up, sitting down, throwing things at each other, picking up the plastic fish and so on. But also using Cuisenaire rods in the silent way, which Stevick writes about, the physicality of the rods, of moving these little colored bits of wood around and to make meanings or to show syntactic structures. That has one would think, and I'm sure Gattegno, who devised the system, would argue, has a powerful effect on memory and learning generally. So, but these are things that need to be re-investigated in the light of socio-materialism, the new materialisms, as well as cognitive linguistics, etc. Lots of things are coming together in a really, really interesting way. And I think Earl Stevick would have loved this conjunction of forces, if you like. What will you do with the more resistant students? Yeah, well, I mean, you have to explain what you're doing, I think. And you also have to make it seem like more adult, I suppose, if not have people throwing things around the room, etc. necessarily, but sort of more conscious. And that the beauty of the silent way with the rods is that it is very silent and it is very focused and it is very cognitive and attention grabbing. But again, you know, it's not all learners like that, like the idea of the teacher being sort of detached, if you were, or not speaking at least. So I'm sorry we're going to have to finish. I'm conscious that some of you it's getting quite late. I look forward to continuing the discussion on the forum. I also look forward to next week's session, which, as I said, is going to be partly assisted by Margaret and Sinem. And it's on the chapter 6, Understanding Language Learner Narratives. So thanks again for your participation, comments, questions, stories. We'll see you on the forum.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you,
Thank
Scott.
you. Have a
Thank
nice
you,
afternoon.
everyone.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.